Last lecture, we looked at the institutional school. We saw that the majority of institutionalism deals with the pervasive influence of institutions on human behavior through rules, norms, and other frameworks. We observed that organizations will adopt similar structures as a result of three types of pressures: coercive pressure, mimetic pressure, and finally normative pressures. In this lecture, we will look more along the lines of the organizational ecology approach. Organizational ecology utilizes insights from biology, economics, and sociology. Theorists who utilize an organization ecology approach attempt to use these academic traditions, coupled with statistical analysis, to understand the conditions in which organizations are born, grow, and die. Now, there's strong applications to a political science literature because we are really keenly interested in how government agencies mature through birth to mortality. So organizational ecology examines the environment in which organizations compete, and a process like natural selection occurs. The theory looks at the death of organizations, what we can call firm mortality or organizational mortality, and the birth of new organizations, organizational founding, as well as organizational growth and change. Organizational ecology has a tendency to have an empirical and quantitative character. There usually is a large-scale and longitudinal focus. When we look at population sort of ecology, and we look at the organizational forms embedded within this sort of analysis, we can suggest that population ecology is the study of dynamic changes within a given set of organizations. They're essentially using the population as their level of analysis, whereby population ecologists are statistically examining the birth and mortality of organizations and organizational forms within the population over long periods. Scholars believe that long-term change in the diversity of organizational forms within a population occurs through selection rather than adaptation. So let me say a few words about this. Selection theories, and notably, are suggesting that most of the variability in core structures of organizations are coming from the creation of new forms and the demise of old ones as the environment sort of demands. In other words, organizations are going to select the organizational forms that's best suited for it within a very changing environmental demand. Whereas adaptation theories are revolved on contingency or resource-dependent theories or Marxist theories, which hold that organizations can adopt strategies or adapt organizational structures to the environmental demands. Effectively, what we're seeing the variance between selection and adaptation is that selection theories suggest that organizations are going to choose the organizational form that's best fit within a particular environmental scenario, whereby adaptation theory suggests that organizations are going to adapt their strategies to adapt to the environmental demands. There are, of course, other types of theories we can analyze. There's the random transformation theories, whereby certain theorists see organizational change as often random walks. Ultimately, analysis in population ecology has three levels. It explains birth and death rates within a population, it explains vital rate interaction between populations, and it examines communities of populations sharing similar environments. In general, population ecologists ascribe to an evolutionary view of organizational change. Organizations descend from previous or existing organizations, and population level change in organizational forms is usually slow and continual. Unlike evolution in animals, natural selection in organizations do not necessarily lead to optimization. Optimized change often depends on the coupling between intent and outcome. Since organizations play key roles in modern society, the speed and direction of a social change depend on the dynamics of organizations. In particular, the ability of society as a whole to respond to changing conditions depend on the responsiveness of its constituent organizations and on the diversity of its organizational populations. We can thus summarize our observations in threefold. 1. Organizations have descended from past organizations. 2. Big differences can now be seen and arising gradually. 3. The process of change are still around us and can be examined experimentally. Population ecology works the idea that long-run changes in organizational diversity reflect the accumulated effects of short-run differences in net mortality rates of populations facing limited resource environments. Most organizations have structural inertia that hinders adaptation when the environment changes. Those organizations that have become incompatible with the environment are eventually replaced through competition with new organizations better suited to external demands. In other words, organizations that are reliable and accountable are those that can survive. They are favored by selection. A negative byproduct, however, of the need for reliability and accountability is a high degree of inertia and resistance to change. A key prediction of organizational ecology is that the process of change itself is so disruptive that it will result in an elevated rate of mortality. Theories about inertia and change are fundamental to the research program of organizational ecology, which seeks a better understanding of the broader changes in the organizational landscape. Given the limits on organizational level adaptation, most of these broader changes can thus come from the entry and selective replacement of organizations. Hence, organizational ecology has spent considerable time on understanding the mortality rates of organizations. We can disaggregate the organization between a generalist and specialist organization. In fact, niche theory distinguishes between these types of organizations, the generalists and specialists. Specialist organizations maximize their exploitation of the environment and accept the risk of experiencing a change in that environment. On the other hand, generalist organizations accept a lower level of exploitation in return for greater security. Niche theory shows that specialization is generally favored in stable or certain environments. However, the main contribution to niche theory is probably the finding that generalism is not always optimal in uncertain environments. The exception is produced by environments which place very different demands on the organization, and the duration of environmental states is short relative to the life of the organization. Thus, niche theory explains variations in organizational structures. One of the salient questions we ask is, why are there so many few forms of organizations? Another salient question is to ask, what are the sources of increasing and decreasing diversity? A stock of organizational forms is of value to a society when the future is uncertain. Therefore, rather than waiting for a new adaptive form to appear, there may already be an organizational form suitable for the sort of new environmental conditions. All that really needs to be done is to reallocate resources to the more optimum form. Population ecology is often focused on longer time spans than other organizational theories. This allows the theory to have much more in common with social history. Since the late 1970s and early 1980s, organizational studies has returned to two fundamental questions. The first question being, how social and historical transformation has affected the world of organizations. The second question being, what role organizational diversity and change play in creating and shaping social change? Ecological analysis is appropriate when organizations are subject to strong inertial pressures and face changeable, uncertain environments. Population ecology pays considerable attention to population dynamics, especially the process of competition among diverse organizations for limited resources, such as membership, capital, and legitimacy. The first level of analysis is looking at the demography of organizations. This is concerned with the variations in vital rates for organizational populations. So this is looking at the founding rates or the disbanding rates, for example. The model attempts to relate these changes to the environment. Briefly, organizational ecology predicts that the rates of founding and the rates of mortality are dependent on the number of organizations, this sort of density. The two central mechanisms here are legitimation, the recognition or taken for grantedness of that group of organizations, as well as competition. Legitimation generally increases at a decreasing rate with the number of organizations, but so does competition at an increasing rate. The result is that legitimation processes will prevail at lower numbers of organizations, while competition at higher numbers. The founding rate will therefore first increase with the number of organizations due to an increase in legitimation, but will decrease at high numbers of organizations due to competition. Now, the reverse holds true for mortality rates. Thus, the relationship of density to founding rates has an inverted U-shape, and the relationship of density to mortality rates follows a U-shaped pattern. The second level of analysis, when we look at population ecology of organizations, tries to show how the vital rates of one population are affected by other organizational populations. Put differently, how an organization's risk of mortality relates to the age of that organization. There are a few patterns that emerge. There's a liability of newness. Here, the risk of failure is it's quite high initially, but declines as the organizational ages. There's a liability of adolescence. The risk of mortality will be low at first as the organization is buffered from failure due to support by external constituents and initial endowments. But when these initial resources become depleted, the mortality hazard shoots up and then declines following the liability of newness pattern. There's also a liability of aging. Here, the risk of failures increase with organizational age. This could be due to a liability of internal inefficiencies arising from the aging of the organization, or due to a liability of growing external mismatch with the environment. Finally, there's a third level, and here in this third level is a community ecology of organizations. This looks at interacting communities of populations, like organizations relating to labor unions or other types of regulatory agencies. What researchers do is that they measure behavior and survival rates of organizations in similar ways as they measure individuals. They collect life histories of samples of organizations in a population, and so, for instance, age is a big predictor of organizational longevity. Again, this is the population, which is the level of analysis. As with all the organizational forms we have looked at thus far in our series of lectures, there are some inherent criticisms that can be afforded to organizational ecology approach. While there is some understanding of dynamic organizational processes of selection, there's little known about inheritance and transmission of organizational forms. They are much more complex than in the biotic world. Darwin's theories of adaptation, however, has been difficult to apply to organizations. Natural selection does not necessarily lead to great adaptability. Also, there's little conscious adaptation in the animal world, while researchers assume more consciousness in organizations struggling to survive in their environment. Organizations can learn and copy other, more adaptive forms. Still, theorists believe the selection process, this sort of Darwinian view, is stronger than organizations' ability to quickly adapt. Critics also ascribe to the belief that much organizational change is random and not necessarily matching expected future states. Therefore, the applicability of a Darwinian conception to understanding organizations and arguments to changes in organizational populations thus depends partially on the tightness of coupling between individual intentions and organizational outcomes. Two situations that create weak couplings are diversity of interests amongst members and uncertainty about means-ends chains. Internal politics often affect the ability of the organization to adapt to external demands. Uncertainty between means and ends can cause unexpected results to changes. This concludes our lecture on organizational ecology, and in fact this is our last lecture looking at organizational forms. In our next lecture, we'll start talking more about conceptualizing power and partnerships, which will lead to a greater discussion in future lectures looking at government and private enterprise relationships and government and non-governmental organization relationships.